I'm Marilyn Dvorkin Warren. I was born here in Omaha at the old St. Joe Hospital in 1940 and lived here for the first 48 years of my life. And then we moved to St. Louis, where I've been for the last 30 years. And St. Louis is home, but Omaha will always be home. As I said, I was born at the old St. Joe's Hospital, and my parents are Dave and Jean Dvorkin. And our first home was in the California Apartments, and then they moved to 17th and Clark, and then we moved to a triplex at 503 South 25th, and then we moved to 3123 Marcy, and then 1009 North 49th Street, and that's where we lived when I got married. My parents are both gone now, and my sister Lois Dvorkin Epstein is also gone, and my husband Marty Warren passed away a little over a year and a half ago. And these are my sons. Mark is the oldest. Mitchell follows him, and none of us live here anymore physically. But if you had just seen the boys at the Nebraska game, you'd think they were still Nebraskans.
Yeah, I don't want to do a Ken O'Hara situation, but we are up by 17 points in half, in half versus Illinois, and maybe I'll win my bet.
So, anyway, I grew up here, as I said. I went to Jackson School. Actually, I started kindergarten at Kellum School.
But she got kicked out for
Yeah.
various disciplinary reasons.
Yeah. So then we had moved, and I went to Jackson School, and I went all through 8 grades there. And then I went to Central High.
A couple times.
Quiet. And then I went to Central High and graduated in 1958 and stayed here. Went to what was then UNO. And my best friend, Verdine Green Klumpus, called me up one Saturday, and she said, there's this guy who just came to town 2 weeks ago, and the gentleman she was dating had met him, and they wanted to fix us up on a blind date. And I told her no. I said I would rather stay home on a Saturday night than go on a blind date. And she said, if you don't go, I'll never speak with you again. And I said, all right, but don't you ever ask me again. So, wasn't sure with a name like Warren if he was even Jewish. And Verdine assured me that he was. When he rang the bell, I was coyly in the kitchen with my mother, and Lois, who was then 14, went to the door and let him in. Came into the kitchen and said, he's Jewish. And so,
as you can see from our schnozzes.
and so as we walked to his car, he said to me, you know, he said, I have a lucky coin in my pocket, and I rubbed it all the way up to your door. And he said, it worked. And how could you not fall in love with a guy like that? And a year and a
finally
half.
found someone who believed that story.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
That's true. Tried it many times.
And a year and a half later, I proposed. And I said, you know, I'm 19 and I'm not getting any younger, so, you know, are we going to get married or should I look around? And so after that, we got married, and these two came along. And Marty came to Omaha from New York. He was a traveling salesman for Fruit of the Loom underwear. He had Nebraska and Iowa.
He was the grape.
And, huh?
He was the grape.
No, he was the orange. Aren't you glad you met him? And he was very successful. And at one point, Dan Gordman gave him a call, and Dan was one of his customers, and Dan asked him if he'd like to come to work at RG. And the boys were, 7 and 4, and Marty he wanted to be with the boys. He didn't want to travel anymore. So he accepted the position, and he was the men's buyer at RG for many, many, many years. And, what else? My dad and mom had an apartment on 90th. They moved from their house into an apartment on 90th off Dodge. And they lived there for, I think, 30 years.
30? That long?
Yeah, yeah. And my mom got sick, so we decided that maybe they should move into assisted living, and then she got really sick, and then my dad got sick from taking care of her. So we knew that Mom had to come to live at the Bloomington home. In Daddy's years, he wasn't gonna live without her, so he came to the Bloomington home as well. And she died within the first 6 months. She had fallen and broken a hip, and she was not doing well, and she passed away. And we said, you know, Daddy, you don't have to stay here. And he said, no, he said, I'll come back here eventually. So he stayed there. He loved it. He loved being there.
He was the mayor of the place.
Yeah, he had all of his faculties, thank God, and he read to the kids in the preschool every week, and he was really in love with the place and in love with the people who worked here. And then he passed away, and
Almost 99.
He was 98, and so, you know, that was the end of our coming to Omaha regularly, which I've missed. Marty was hired by Dillard's to come, and he started the men's shoe department there, and the corporate office in St. Louis, and he was very happy there, and he was past retirement age, and he said, you know, as long as I'm happy, I'm not going to retire. And one day he came home and he said, you know, he said, I don't think I'm so happy anymore. He said, I gave him 2 weeks' notice. So excuse me. So he retired in 2005, and we took our first trip to Israel, his only trip to Israel, and he played golf every day. He loved it, and the boys came to St. Louis for his 80th birthday, and that was his last round of golf. He became ill after that, and 3 years later he passed away. So he's back here, and we have plots next to my sister, and my brother-in-law Mel Epstein and I will eventually take the 2 empty ones. Lois and I are next to each other so that we can string a telephone line between us. And that was arranged way before she became ill. So as I said, I grew up here, and when I was in elementary school, I was in Young Judea, and then in high school I was in BBG. I was in 2 different groups, and my good friends, there were 5 of us, Virginia Green and Maxine Kirschenbaum and Maddie Myroff and Judy Freed, and we had a lot of fun together. Maxine was Zweiback at the time. That was her maiden name. And I didn't do a lot until I was not bat mitzvahed. My parents, I was a girl, you know, we went to Beth Israel religiously, i.e. on the high holidays. And religion wasn't important for us because we were girls. And even my grandmother, who lived with us, my mother's mother, she lit the Shabbos candles every Friday night.
What was her name, Marilyn?
Her name was Rose Glazer, and she lit them in her bedroom because she wasn't ashamed or embarrassed, but and she didn't mean to hide her Judaism, but she thought she wanted to be American, and people might make fun if she acted Jewish. She was frum in her own way, which meant that we didn't keep a strictly kosher home, but we went to the butcher shop every Sunday to get the bread and the meat for the week. Still amazes me that she, in the hottest day of the summer, she could take a piece of chuck and put it on the drain board and salt it and let it sit there all day, and none of us ever got sick from any disease. So, anyway, she spoke perfect English, but she couldn't read or write. She had fingers of gold. She could sew anything. I would show her a pattern, a dress or something in a newspaper, and she would make a pattern and make me the dress. I must say I never really appreciated it because I really wanted store-bought stuff, but her fingers were golden. And my dad was from Sioux City, Iowa. I'm just floating all around
Yeah,
here.
it's great.
It's okay.
He was from Sioux City, Iowa. He was fixed up on a blind date with my mother. And the Historical Society has the newspaper from one of their anniversaries that Lois and I made up of their life and everything. But he called her a week or two after they had met, and he proposed to her. And it was later on that they were married, I think about a year. And he was good friends with a woman in Sioux City, Bernice, I can't think of her maiden name. And Mom was good friends of Abe Polikoff here. So Abe would call my mother and say, Jean, you want to go to Sioux City and see Dave? And he and Mom would drive to Sioux City to see Daddy and Bernice. And Daddy would call Bernice and say, you want to go to Omaha and see Abe? And then the two of them would drive up here to see Mom and Abe. And the Polikoffs were very close friends, and their extended family were, their sisters and brothers were very close friends with my family. When we moved to 25th Avenue, we lived next to Keith and Dorothy Peltz and Lori and Rita. And Rita was 2 years older than I, and we were friends growing up. And then the other family that was very close to us was the Corney family. Daddy, when he came to Omaha, he was a baker, and he worked at the Schultz Baking Company, butternut bread. And there was a maintenance man, a stationary engineer, and he would go around whistling the Sweetheart song. And Daddy was really getting upset because he thought this was some anti-Semite. And he finally said something to the guy. And he and Norm Corney became best friends until the day that Norm passed away. And from the Corneys came Norm's sister Ellabelle and her husband Abe Schloff. And the four of them were very close. And then there were cousins, Betsy and Joe Reutzstein. And so that was the other third part of our so-called extended family. And we just, had these wonderful friends that every weekend something was done with them when I was growing up. When, excuse me, as I said, we belonged to Beth Israel. And when I met Marty, and the first High Holiday he was here, I asked him if he wanted to go to High Holiday services with us. And he looked at me and he said, no. And I said, we sit together, men and women. And he said, oh, okay. He was brought up Orthodox New York, and he did not want to sit separately from me. And
Until a number of years of marriage.
Stop it. And we didn't really enjoy Beth Israel because, pardon me, because I couldn't read Hebrew. I didn't know if I had the book upside down and backwards. So we went to Bethel, and we got married at Bethel by Rabbi Kripke. And it was another story when he asked my Hebrew name, and I told him it was Mirka Elke. And he looked at me and he said, that can't be.
It's Yiddish, not Hebrew.
And I said, that's what I've been told. And he said, you go home and ask your father. So I went home and I said, Daddy, I said, what's going on here? He said, that's not my name. And my dad was very upset. He says, you tell him that you were named in the synagogue, Mirka Elke. So, pardon me. So my allergies from St. Louis have followed me to Omaha. And so anyway, that is my name. That's what's on my
Is
marriage
it Hebrew
license.
though, or is it Yiddish?
It's Yiddish. It's a diminutive of
Right.
Yiddish, but that's what my name is. I was named after my mother's sister, Marilyn Glazer. And excuse me. And she changed her name from Mary to Marilyn after the movie star Marilyn Miller. Otherwise, I would be Mary. And Grammy, who's name was Jean, Jeanne, was, her name was, she changed the spelling, that's what it was. She changed the spelling to Jeanne. Oh, she was Jenny originally.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
And her sister Molly just changed the spelling from plain old Molly to Mollye. But.
I may add an E to my name, just for family's sake.
Pardon me?
I'll just add an E to the end of my name.
Michelle.
So anyhow, where was I? I forgot.
You were getting married at Bethel.
Oh yeah, we got married at Bethel. And we went to Bethel for 2 years, and we really were missing something, so we went back to Beth Israel, and we didn't find it there. And finally we decided we'll try Temple. And Marty said to me, if this doesn't work, we're gonna have to go to pay TV. Well, let's proceed to the year or so before he passed away. And every Friday night, we were unable to go to our temple in St. Louis, and we streamed services in our family room. And I said, well, his prediction came true. We are watching our services on television. So anyhow, so we did go to temple, and the first thing that struck us was the decorum of the congregants. And the second thing that struck us
Decorum being better or worse?
better, I mean, it was.
Because there's no kibitzing
There was
in the
no
middle?
chatter.
Right,
I
okay.
mean, it was everybody, and everybody knew what they were doing. And it was remarkable because we'd come from a place where, let's face it, my mom went to chat with her friends. And all the women sat in the back chattering. So anyway, we enjoyed temple, and Mark went to preschool there, and then Mitchell went to preschool there, and I became involved with the sisterhood. My friend Judy Van Goldstein called me up one day, and she said, sisterhood wants me to, there was some committee, I can't remember what it was, and she said I would only do it if you could be my co-chair, and I said fine. And I went on to co-chair several different committees there, and I thought, how can I bring my children to this place for preschool and not become an active member? And I became very active in the sisterhood, and I one day became president, which I cherished, and I cherished the friendships that I made. And I really think I grew up from sisterhood and going around the district, and I was on the district board, so when I went to St. Louis, I knew people, which was a big help. In the meantime, the boys, Mark was active in AZA, and he can tell you about that in a few minutes. Mitchell was active in Temple Youth Group and went on to become the national president. And so he had a connection to St. Louis also, which I knew people from his connections. So it was an easy move for us. Marty and I both served on the board. We started the Young Couples Club at Temple, and we were board members. And then the tornado came, and that was.
One of the rabbi's cars ended up on the
Rabbi
roof. as I
Weinstein's
recall.
car
Oh,
on
it
the
was,
roof of the temple.
it was horrendous. And I have in my kitchen a piece of the original stained glass windows that I picked up from the parking lot. And jumping ahead to a year ago, I had a fire in my home. And I had this piece of stained glass on the kitchen window frame. And the fire was in the microwave. It was an electrical short, and the fire department came and they knocked out the window. And I was devastated because amongst the things that were lost that meant a lot was that piece of stained glass. And when I unwrapped the things, when I moved back into the house 7 months later, they had retrieved it and they cleaned it and wrapped it up, so it's back on the windowsill. Anyway, so where was we were active in the temple, and the boys became active Jewish young men, and they each have a wife, and they each have a son, and they each have a daughter. So I'm blessed with 4 grandchildren.
Different wives, different sons, and
To be
different
clear.
daughters, just to be clear.
Just to be clear.
Yeah.
And in the meantime, when we moved to St. Louis, being in retailing, we couldn't, excuse me, going back, moving to St. Louis, it was, the worst part of leaving here was leaving my family, because we were very close. We were always together every Sunday. And our 2 boys, my sister and brother-in-law's 3 girls, were like brothers and sisters. In fact, when Ricky, the youngest niece, was bat mitzvahed, she said in her speech, I always felt I had 2 sets of parents, because the girls always came to our house after, when they were in junior high. They went to Beveridge, and we lived right down the hill. And so they would come, they had the combination to get into the garage and to come into the house, and they knew where the Oreos were. And then Lois would pick them up
We never
later.
knew where the Oreos were.
No, I hid them from you.
That's right.
Actually, what I hid from you was the M&Ms. You never knew that. I used to have an oatmeal box in the refrigerator, and I always had my M&Ms in it. And
Good to
I
know.
never told your father or you guys that I had M&Ms there, because I didn't want you all to eat them. So, now I can leave them
Explains
out
our
in the open.
competitiveness, perhaps.
So, anyhow, Lois and I were extremely close, and when, at one point, she and Mel moved to Little Rock and Nashville, and so we devised, because it was expensive to talk on the phone long distance, so we devised a system that we made tape recorders. We got Mom and Dad a tape recorder, and so we all tape recorded things and mailed them back and forth to each other. But Lois and I still managed to talk about once a week. And then they moved back to Omaha. And until their house was, excuse me, until they found a house and moved, they lived with us. So there were 9 of us living in the house, and we had the best times. Lois and I played Scrabble every single
Till
night.
like 3 in the morning.
Until 2 or 3 in the morning, and Ricky was a baby, and she would start to cry, and so we'd have to bring her down and put her on the floor in the doorway between the living room and dining room so she could see us, and then she was okay. So it was really hard when we moved to St. Louis, and Marty, being in retailing, could not take off for Thanksgiving. So Lois said, suppose we all came down to St. Louis. And I said, great. So they all came down, and we had accommodations for all of us, including Mom and Dad. And Randy was a freshman. My sister's oldest daughter, Randy, was a freshman at KU. So they picked her up on the way down. And in the meantime, my youngest niece, Ricky, was active in youth group at Temple here. And she had a best friend from going to all the conclaves. She had a best friend in St. Louis. And they realized that in a couple short years, they would no longer be getting together like this, because they'd be going off to college, and how sad, because they were the best of friends. And then they each realized that they had an older sibling.
Of the opposite sex.
Ricky had a sister, Randy, and Joanna had a brother, Michael. So, because the family was coming to us for Thanksgiving, the girls fixed Randy and Michael up. And eventually Randy and Michael got married. So Randy was living in St. Louis. My middle niece, Robin, graduated from KU, or from Iowa, from Iowa. And she eventually moved to St. Louis. And Ricky ended up at the University of Missouri. So we could frequently get together, and I was very fortunate to have the 2 girls living in St. Louis. Robin subsequently moved away, but then she and her family moved back. So now I have Randy and her family and Robin and hers living in St. Louis, while my boys are on the East Coast. So it's like I do have 2 2 daughters living there, and my niece in Denver calls me more often than my sons do. She probably calls me once a week just to check up on me, and so the closeness is still there, and it's great. And so when I moved to St. Louis, I was active in the sisterhood because of the district, and we joined Share Emmett Congregation, and I was active there for a while. But in the meantime, I said to Marty, when we first moved there, I said, you know, I can't go shopping and out to lunch every day. I've got to find a job. While I was here, let me go back. After I was through being president of the sisterhood, I knew that I had to get away so that others, you know, you don't need an old president telling everybody what to do. So I was going to find something else. I came up, excuse me, I had an article from Morris Mullane, and I dropped it off in his office. And he looked at me and he said, how would you like to be an outside salesperson? And I laughed. And I said, let me think about it. I went home and I told Marty, and I thought it was a joke. He said to me, I mean, he was my biggest booster. He said to me, oh, you'll do great. I said, I don't know the first thing about selling. He said, you'll do fine. And so I accepted it, and I was an advertising salesperson for the Jewish Press for 9 years. And then I was also active in council, in which we here call council, and in St. Louis it's NCJW. But anyway, I was active, and I was on the executive committee of council, and the best part about that was once a year we got together to do the yearbook, and Lois Friedman, may she rest in peace, she knew everything about everybody. And so she could tell you, oh, that person just sold their house, and that person just did this, and that. So, excuse me, I had to call somebody to ascertain that they were moving to a certain address, and the person said to me, how do you know this? I mean, we knew everything. So that was the great thing about being on the council board, was finding out about everybody. And
So it's a bunch of yentas, is that what you're saying?
in a nice way.
Okay.
And I was also active in the Historical Society. And Mary Feldman, may she rest in peace, asked me one day if I would lead one of the guided bus tours. Mitchell happened to be in town, remember that? You were in town from college, and you drove me the tour
I do, yeah.
out to North Omaha, because we had 2 buses going. And so I wanted to find out where the landmarks were, for sure. So you drove me around
That's
so that
right.
I could pick everything out and know what I was talking about. And I was on the board for a short time here. And then my mother-in-law, may she rest in peace, who was here in the Blumkin home, passed as she got sick. It was before she came to the Blumkin home, she became ill. And I just couldn't handle her illness and being on the board, and I had to resign, which was a very sad day for me because I really loved being part of this organization. And I loved working with Mary. Excuse me, she was phenomenal. And anyway, so now I'll jump forward to going to St. Louis. Sorry, I should have written all this down, and I had to read chronologically. So anyway, I said to Marty, you know, I got to find something to do because I can't just shop and go out to lunch. And so I was reading our Jewish Light newspaper, and the JCC there was looking for somebody. They were starting a satellite
Building.
thank you.
You're welcome.
And they needed a secretary. So I applied for the job, and I got it, and I was there for 9 years, and I loved it. We were in a storefront, and we had a fitness center and a children's activity center. And then we left the storefront and went to an Orthodox shul, where we had a wing that we had a children's activity center, which was phenomenal. And then we had a new building, the J had 2 locations, and I went to the new location, and I was not happy there because I couldn't do what I had been doing, and I was the greeter at the front desk, and that just wasn't what I wanted to do. So one day I saw that there was an ad in the Light that my temple preschool was looking for a secretary. And so I knew I was on the temple board there, and I knew the director. So I wrote her a note at her home, and I said, I'm interested, but I don't want to come to the temple and see you. So if you're interested in me, let's meet for coffee, and if not, let's just pretend this letter never happened. She called me immediately. We met for coffee. She offered me the job. I took it. I was there 13 years. I loved every minute of it. To this day, I'm still Miss Maryland to some of the kids. Our junior rabbi's daughter is becoming a bat mitzvah at the end of this month. And she still hugs me and calls me Miss Maryland whenever she sees me. And I was having a manicure one day, and a little girl came up and tapped me on the shoulder, and she said, Miss Maryland, I don't know if you remember me, but I'm so-and-so. And the kids always remembered me. I don't know if it was the lopsided haircut or the fact that I always gave them pretzels in the office, and I'd have them, I'd give them one for this hand, and then I'd say, okay, give me your other hand, because we don't want it to get lonely. So they all had 2 pretzels, and they all remember that. And those were joyous days, and I retired right before Marty became ill, so the timing, I guess, was meant to be. And so since that time, Marty passed away a little over a year and a half ago. And I'm in St. Louis with my nieces. My sons are still on the East Coast. So what do you guys have to say?
I think it's likely we'll probably stay on the East Coast as much as great as growing up here was, and it really was great place to grow up. Even though I've spent more time in New York, 28 till 55, thus far in New York, 0 to 18 here, I would still say this is my home, and I remain a huge fan. I remain a huge fan of the football team. Maybe today it'll be a good one, but since we joined the Big Ten, not such a good run, especially if you bet on them, as I occasionally do. But an amazing place to live, and the interesting thing for me is how my Judaism has changed over my life. Growing up here, we went to Burke High. We were middle class. We were in the vast minority, I would say, Jews. That is, in our class my class was like 670, 680, and I suspect certainly under 5%, probably under 3% of us were Jews, as compared to my friends at Westside, and that was a big difference. And I definitely, in retrospect, I didn't really know it, and didn't really communicate it to my family at the time. But there was real anti-Semitism at the time that I lived with as a kid, starting that I can remember from when I was a Cub Scout or a Weeblo, and getting beat up pretty badly for being the little Jewish kid when I was we've talked about that, and other teachers at various places calling me the Kaik or the Yid or the Jew boy, which I didn't really communicate to anybody.
No, you didn't.
And it kind of permeated. I was not as participatory in the religious or the socially religious aspects of growing up in Omaha, but strangely over time I've gone back a lot more probably than certainly y'all would have expected me to be.
True.
So we were raised Reform at Temple. I abhorred going to shul. Didn't really do too well in my bar mitzvah, but I'm fairly observant today. I've a kosher style for 25 plus years, and very involved in the community there. And I think a lot of that is because of the strength of the community here, and some role models that I had that I don't think I would have turned out the way I turned out, for good or for bad, but mostly the good parts, through some of the people that I met growing up here, many of whom are my friends, my childhood friends' fathers, who were different examples than my father in terms of what they did and how they turned out in the community, and that was real important to me, and I think about that a lot, and I think it's the examples that they set in terms of philanthropy and participation. And
Where do you
giving back.
live?
Upper West Side of New York City.
Okay.
So fairly involved in the community, in the Jewish community there, religiously, socially, especially social justice-wise. And I remember another interesting thing growing up. Obviously, when you grow up in Nebraska, you got hurricanes, and, not hurricanes, tornadoes. And I remember we were driving perhaps to Wisconsin, where Mitchell and I went to school once, or maybe it was someplace else. We were younger.
You didn't go to school once. You were once
We were
driving.
yeah. So sometime, it wasn't school, but we were driving somewhere and there was a hurricane, and our family,
Tornado.
Sorry, our family's driving past this place, and there's a highway patrol person or whatever with a bucket taking money. We were not extraordinarily wealthy. My parents, my mother, we stopped, and she wrote for her a pretty significant check, to this town in the middle of Iowa.
No, it was in
wherever.
Wisconsin,
Or
sweetheart.
Wisconsin, and I thought about that,
remember
and
that.
that's important to me. Important example.
Who were some of your friends here?
My two best friends growing up were J.D. Gordman and Jeff Gordman growing up, and I was in Chaim Weitzman. It was mostly West Side kids who tended to have a little more guilt than our family. So got to meet lots of those guys. I was a pretty good golfer growing up. I was a caddy at Highland, and got to caddy for some people and just hear how wealthier folks talked and lived and thought about things. Got to see some significant gambling on the golf course and otherwise, and kind of took to that in not in an addictive way, but in a very fun, competitive way. I'm a fairly competitive person. I worked on Wall Street for a long time, and did all right in business, and got to see had certain friends who's Phil Schrager, Tommy Fellman. I grew up with their kids and remained very close with Tommy and with Phil's kids, and the philanthropy that they did and and collecting of art, that was something I didn't see growing up, and that definitely permeated with me and has had an effect.
Do you want to talk about your family then?
No.
You
no.
married?
Yeah, no. So I bet they would have been pretty surprised that I would marry a Jewish woman, after the way I grew up and was in college. But it wasn't much of a choice. That would be the way I'd go. By the way, I might be somewhat observant. She's an atheist, and that's okay. We all do it our own way. But married a Jersey girl who's lived on the Upper West Side of Manhattan for 25 plus years. Have a couple of kids, a senior in college, Rachel, a freshman in college, Ben, and I feel all has turned out real well. Baruch Hashem.
So I also grew up in Omaha, a few years after Mark.
Although he was adopted.
Oh, he was not. Now stop it.
And it's remarkable in many ways to think that we had similar upbringings, but probably quite different experiences, even though just 3 years apart. I also now live in New York, but spent a number of years abroad with my wife, and where our kids were born. But a lot of my life has been around social justice, which very much was defined by my experiences here in Temple. Very fond memories and very influential memories, and think very fondly, particularly of Rabbi Brooks, who was a huge figure, I think, for all of us in the family. And we entered this world after my parents had wandered throughout the synagogues, but I guess for us, Temple Israel was always home, and Sydney was certainly a huge inspiration and role model. And I was also involved in AZA, was a member of Chaim Weitzman, but was also very active in the youth group at the Temple, but predominantly from a social justice perspective, and kind of what I always sought to do, and have spent my career working in nonprofits, mainly in public health, HIV prevention, and ended up in South Africa shortly after I finished university, and lived there for 5 years, right at the beginning of the Mandela period. I moved about a year before he was elected president of South Africa, so I was able to live during a remarkable transformation. And I can always remember being in touch with Rabbi Brooks throughout those times, and had great letters in the pre-email days, and about my experiences there. And I remember very fondly, I was distributing condoms in South Africa for AIDS prevention, and I'd written Sydney about a Zulu tradition that made condom use very difficult. And it turns out the Zulu tradition was very similar to the Jewish tradition about not wanting to capture the seed, which is why condom use was very hard in Zulu cultures. but it was a very similar experience in Jewish culture. So it was things I always picked up from him. And I lived there in the 90s, as I say, with my wife at the time, and still wife. We had both our kids there, and then moved to London, and then back to the States, which was largely driven by the fact we wanted to be, although my mother would say we're not close enough, we did come back to New York at
Jewish
least.
mother.
Who never came to South Africa. My father, I know he always wanted to go to South Africa. My mother never wanted to be on a plane that long.
No, that wasn't it.
That's what you told me.
I didn't want to go because I couldn't go to South Africa without seeing the country, but I couldn't leave this precious grandchild and then grandchildren to go see the country. So
Ah.
I was
So you didn't
happier.
come at all.
No, but we came to London.
Missed opportunity. But in any case, we did end up moving back here when the kids were 6 and 3, so we were released in the U.S., and we felt it was important to be a little closer to our extended families on both of our sides. We now enjoy the fact that one is a junior at university and the other is in graduate school to be an architect. They've spent very little time in Omaha, which I think is sad in many respects. Mom and Dad moved to St. Louis the year that after I graduated from university, and in fact I dodged a bullet. They almost moved from Omaha to Washington D.C. I had just moved from college to Washington, and within a month or so of my moving there, they called and said they were coming for Dad to have a job interview. And I thought, wait a minute, I just moved to the city, and now they're moving here too. But they did not. They moved to St. Louis instead, which has been lovely for them, but a little sad in that Omaha did not get a lot of our attention because we would go to visit our parents there, and then certainly with our kids, although perhaps not visiting often enough, we are more likely to visit there than here. So our times here have tended to be, over the last decade or so, very sadly, in people's declining periods, and coming back more for funerals and memorials than for family celebrations. But I can remember, and it's something that you said, Mom, growing up every Sunday, it would be, typically within the course of any 1 month, it would be at either my aunt's house, Aunt Yo's house, or our house, or at Grandma and Grandpa's apartment.
Or alternatively, Garot's.
Or the fourth weekend a month would be at a restaurant, and it would typically be driven by the birthday celebrants selection. So there were 4 of us, 5 of my aunt and uncle and their 3 girls, and Grandma and Grandpa, and Grandma Lil. So 12 of us, and so we pretty much would be at a restaurant once a month, and then at one of the houses pretty much every single Sunday for my entire life until I went to college. Very fond memories. Not always the fondest culinary memories. The cooking was not always the high point. Don't deny it, Mom. Luckily, we got to go to restaurants occasionally.
You're out of the will.
But incredibly strong feelings about being close to a family like that, and it was just always just what you did. It wasn't onerous, and it wasn't. It was an expectation and a requirement, really, but it wasn't one that seemed onerous at all. It was actually quite joyous, all of those meals. I think we all kind of laugh about it, joke about it now, but that's pretty remarkable that a group of that size would be together for so many meals.
Excuse me, let me
no.
interject. After we moved to St. Louis, Grammy and Grampy started going out on Sundays with Norman Gerton
Right.
and their friends. And I said to Lois one day, I said, do you think they really wanted to do that on Sundays? Because I kept calling up and saying, okay, we're going to my house, or we're going to your house, or we're going to their house. I said, do you think that's why we ended up every Sunday, that maybe they really wanted to be with friends but never told us?
Well, they had 6 other nights of the week. But it's funny, I was thinking about the fact that when they moved to that apartment, I remember, my grandparents at the time they were both retired, Grandma from Sears and Grandpa from...
No, they weren't retired when
When they moved to the
there.
apartment to 93? They were still around?
He was.
They were still working.
Was he?
I don't know about that.
They were both still
We have to
working.
fact check that one.
Yeah, we'll fact check it.
But in any case, they moved to the apartment from the house, which is where they had been for, when did they move to the apartment? In 70?
When I was 13.
No, to the apartment.
Oh, to the apartment in 75.
Okay, so I was 9. I thought of them as kind of old grandparents moving from their house to the apartment, and knowing that they lived in that apartment for 30 years is quite remarkable.
Right.
But yeah, that just became the other stopping point on our varying weekends. And even as we got older, and even with our, we would have activities through youth group or through high school sports or whatever, but we would always still, Sunday nights were almost in some ways more sacred than Friday nights, so that we often would go to services and go to the Burke High School football game. But Sundays were actually in many ways more of an important defining moment for our family than even going to services, which we did most weekends. It was actually very fond memories of that.
I want to go back a little bit to Temple. You mentioned Sidney, may he rest in peace. He was fantastic, and I remember when you were in preschool, and our closest friends are David, and still are, David and Judy Goldstein, and their 2 boys were the same ages as these 2. So we were, the 8 of us, together quite a bit. We went on trips together, and just very, very close. And one birthday, we went out to Mr. C's, the 8 of us.
Oh, I remember what you were going to say.
It was Mitchell's birthday. And all of a sudden, over at the loudspeaker came, Mr. C's would like to wish a happy birthday to Jeremy.
To Jeremy.
And so we're looking around, where's Jeremy, because I had told the waitress that it was Mitchell's birthday. Well, Mark and Joe Goldstein are convulsively laughing because they cornered the waitress and they told her his name was Jeremy. There was a football player at Nebraska and his name was Jeremy. And they thought this was very funny. So they were...
So like 14 people that work at the restaurant have a cake with candles and stuff, and they're all singing happy birthday to Jeremy. And of
At
course
our
And
table.
they would come to our
Mitchell.
table.
And Joe and I
Fun.
would do that. And that was the first time I did that, but I've probably done it 40 or 45 times since then. It's always a shock to whoever's not named Jeremy when he or she gets sung happy birthday. It's a great scam if you ever want.
I was thinking, with Joe particularly and David, we were a golfing family. Mom perhaps more begrudgingly than certainly my father and the 2 of us. Family lore goes that you learn to play only because it was a way to spend time with your sons and your husband on the weekends. But my father would play. He would work on Saturdays, and we would all play Saturday afternoon. And on Sundays, he would play every Sunday morning with David and a couple of other guys, his group for years. And then he'd come home quickly for lunch, and then all 4 of us would go out and play golf on Sunday afternoons.
That's where you learn to swear.
And I was taught to swear by my father and my brother, clearly. I was a quick study, though.
Yes.
And you did more than a handful of times always say by the 2nd hole, if you use that word one more time, I'm going to walk off. And so you rarely finished 9 holes, as I recall.
I finished 9.
But walked off with some frequency. I had certainly, I think, a worse temper than
Most folks.
than many in the family. But we had great fun on the course, and the crazy part is that Dad probably had the most fun on the course.
He was the least gifted
But he was the
athlete
least
by
gifted
far.
golfer.
Although he's the only one that had a whole.
He's-
My handicap was as low as like 4.7 or 4.8, and I've yet to have a hole in one.
The only hole-in-one in the family.
Yes, that's true.
Although it was witnessed by David, Judy, and Mom,
That's
so I
true.
never believed
They-
the
they
veracity
always said it was.
of the witnesses. We always said that wasn't true. But it was actually where we hung out with our friends, and it was many of the same people who were at Temple. So it was just that kind of tight community. And I also caddied, as did Mark at Highland, but I only caddied for one person ever. It was Bob Epstein. I inherited his bag, I think, from you when you went to college. And so I had, I guess, 3 years of being able to caddy, and it was remarkable. He was a great golfer, great gambler,
Great
and
competitor.
great competitor. I loved when he won because he was very generous when he won. When he lost, it was not always a happy day.
Actually, one time I caddied for Bobby, who I still see, and whose son and daughter are friends of mine. But he was away, and I caddied for somebody else whose name I can't say. But just suffice to say, not nearly as nice a person, bad temper, much heavier bag, and we were on the 2nd hole, and all of a sudden somebody yells 4, which duck, look out, and everybody goes like this so they don't get hit in the head with the golf ball. It hits him in the nether regions, and just like in the movies, his eyes roll back. This person I'm caddying for, whose ball's, by the way, a terrible tipper. His eyes roll back. He passes out. Holy moly! What do we do? And being the shortest, fastest, youngest one there, they point me up to the clubhouse. Let's, Warren, you go up there. Let's get an ambulance. So I go and I get an ambulance, and the ambulance comes really quickly, and it goes down the rough so it doesn't mess up the fairway. Like in the movies, they have smelling salt. The guy wakes up like this. They put him on a stroller, on a stretcher. They put him back in there, and I'm saying to myself, gosh, this is great. Only 30 minutes have passed. I can get a real tip from a real player. Not this person, and probably don't have to caddy for him for another couple weeks because he'll be in the hospital. And bottom line is, I pick up my new person, I caddy for him. I'm on the 18th hole, and I see the pro with this very attractive woman on the 18th hole, and I hear him saying my name, Warren, and they're pointing to me. And I was like, oh no, this is terrible. I probably went over her flowers on the way to work this morning on my bike, and I'm going to get in trouble and maybe fired. And it turns out this is the guy who got hit by the golf ball in that special place. It was his second wife. And she was very appreciative that I was able to help him and I got a $50 tip when I was probably 15 or 12 years old. I'd never gotten a tip like that before, and I got a real tip from the second game.
Oh, a good day.
Yeah, it was a good
the
day.
great part about thinking about Highland, one of the things from Omaha I'm incredibly proud of. I left here a very long time ago, but just thinking that Highland is now this home to with the remarkable Tri-Faith Initiative, I'm often describing it to people all over the world when I travel, and it is with enormous pride, given where this world is today, that Omaha is home to that.
Yeah.
And a little sad that Highland is no longer the golf course, because it was a pretty great place. But to drive by and see the temple, the mosque, and the church now in development is it really. There's so many things about growing up in Omaha that do make me incredibly proud, and that may be just about the proudest one. That it is here and nowhere else, despite all of the odds. And people will often joke when they hear, as I think many of us experience, being a Jew from Omaha seems like an anomaly because there are relatively few, and I always have described it as a very strong and tight Jewish community. And I think the Tri-Faith Initiative is just a remarkable testament to that, and a very special thing that I hope the entire community is incredibly proud of, because it is something unlike anything I've seen anywhere in my work internationally.
Exactly. And speaking of which, we all arrived about the same time yesterday, met at the airport, got in the car, and went right to Temple for services, and it was just so nice to be back. Although this was never our physical location, it was just nice to be back at Temple.
Terribly
And-
cold night. It was freezing.
Yeah.
It was in the chapel. There
And
were probably
there-
40 people. We knew a third of them. It was
Yeah,
great.
and it was just great. But going back to the early years, when the boys were in preschool, and there was a Hanukkah dinner or something at Temple, and the Goldsteins and the four of us went, and who comes to sit at our table but Rabbi and Mrs. Brooks? Well, 4 little kids couldn't eat. They sat there with their mouths open, staring at their rabbi, who they thought he was God, and here he's sitting at the table with them. And one of my favorite pictures I have is of Sydney and you 2 boys coming home from college for one of the girls' bat mitzvahs.
Sitting on his desk.
his
And
study.
you were in his study, and I took a picture, and that's still on my mantle. It was just one of my favorite things. He was.
He had a great office. It was
He was,
huge.
without a doubt, one of the finest gentlemen. And we were so lucky to have him as a rabbi. And then to get Aryeh was just like the cherry on top. And Aryeh, who retired, came out of retirement to officiate at Marty's funeral, and he will officiate tomorrow at his dedication. So I'm so grateful to have these 2 rabbis in our family's life.
Yeah, they were great. It's really sad because people love, they want services to be brief, and even last night everyone was happy there was no sermon. To me, the sermon was the best part of every service. People get up and leave during that often, and
Really?
for me, oh yeah, that happens all the time. And for me, both Sydney and Aryeh, hearing their sermons, that to me is the best part. I always loved that. But I have the fondest memory of it was during high holidays. I'll never forget. It was the youth service, and we were probably in elementary school, and he had Rabbi Brooks brought in this huge plate glass, and he wanted, the whole idea was about seeing through things and, you know, focusing on the new year. And I'll never forget, he held it up and he said, "What do you see looking through this glass?" And one of the Greenberg boys, I think it was, it wasn't
Robert?
Randy. No,
Robert.
I think it was Mike. I can't remember.
Mike.
One of them said, "I see fingerprints," and it's a very fond memory. That and Rabbi Brooks's three-legged dog.
Greenberg
Yes,
turned out to be a real spiritual person, as you might imagine.
But, no, I mean, there were just, a lot of our life was around the temple. We joined officially when Mark began preschool, because at that time, non-members could not go to the preschool, and I had heard such good things about it. And we'd attended services and decided that that this was gonna be our place. So we joined the temple, and one of the first Hanukkahs, we see that, oh no, this was a couple years later, because Mitchell was about 3 or 4. So you were about 6 or 7. And for Hanukkah, they were doing Judah Maccabee. And I said to Marty, this might be a fun thing for the kids to do. So we go to services and we walk in. There were no other kids there. And we sat down, and it was the opera, Judah Maccabee. It was not for children. So we stayed about 5 or 10 minutes, and we left because we didn't want the kids disturbing the congregants. But after that, we began taking them on a pretty regular basis. And I remember one high holiday, one of my friends from Sisterhood, who was old enough to be my mother, came up to me and said, "How do you get them to sit through services like that?"
This is before Ritalin was invented, by the way.
Mark, please. And I just looked at her and I said, because we've been bringing them since they were little kids. We took them, not every Friday, but frequently on Fridays, so that when we did take them for the high holidays or something, they knew how to sit. And that really pleased me, that they grew up to be the young men that they are. So,
Well, thank you for saying we're young still. That's nice.
well, you're younger than I am.
I think of myself that way.
That's how you feel.
So, anyway, I don't know, is there anything, what have we missed?
Omaha's a great, I've lived in New York since '89. I see the majority of the folks that live in New York generally come from there or other big cities. And where are you from? And I'll say Omaha, Nebraska, and they always laugh. A Jew from Nebraska, but really, really special place, place to grow up, and unique. I can't imagine a better place to have come from. There are very few other spots I could live in besides New York or maybe San Francisco or London. But seriously, Omaha would be one of them. It's a pretty special place.
Do you remember when you were a freshman and we went up for Parents Weekend? I think that was the time we took Jeff Kirschenbaum
Yeah.
with us.
We did. Yeah.
And
Oh, I remember
first
that.
of all, we were sitting with
No, that wasn't
Lav.
freshman year.
We
We went with Jeff on sophomore year because we stayed in the fraternity house.
Okay.
It was debauched
Well,
that year.
whenever it was that we were there for
You make
Parents
debauch
Weekend.
seem like a bad thing.
No, that
and
was a
we were-
compliment.
And we were sitting with the Lavins, and they couldn't believe there were Jews in Omaha, Nebraska.
Okay.
I mean, they were from Chicago.
They were proven wrong. I made
And
money
they
on that
couldn't
bet.
belie-
It was
They
fantastic.
couldn't believe it. But when we went with Jeff, when we took him up that time, he told us later that some of the fraternity brothers had pulled us aside, or was it you? They pulled us aside.
I don't know the story.
No, they pulled him aside, and they wanted to know if Mark was adopted or something, because his name was, what was the deal? His name was different.
Hoffman. My nickname was
Mr.
Hoffman.
Hoffman.
That's right.
It was Mr. Hoffman, and we
Another-
were all
another
Warrens.
story
We were all
not appropriate for this.
We were all Warrens, and so they all wanted to know. I mean, this is the kind of kid that he is. They want to know if we were his real parents, if Mitchell were
We
his
still
real
want
brother.
to. We still
Did
want
we
to know
still-
that.
Well, we wonder sometimes. I think sometimes that they might have gotten us
Swapped.
crossed in the, yeah.
One never knows.
Never know, never know. So, I can't think of anything else. I guess
That's
that's
a- it's a
really
good way to
the-
end it.
I
Thank
guess
you.
that's the story of us.